Today I'd like to show you how you can take much stronger control of your image traces inside of Illustrator by using Photoshop. So let's have a quick introduction to image trace, and I can show you the issue that I'm actually talking about. So we're inside of Illustrator just here. I've got an image just out on my desktop just here. Actually, this is a picture of a good mate of mine called Luke. So Luke, thank you for letting me use your face for this demonstration. So inside of Illustrator, all I've done is from my desktop just dragged that image straight in. So with that selected, you can see over here inside of the properties panel, I have a bunch of options just down here, one of them being image trace. So if I click on that and choose default, it's giving me just that, the default image trace inside of Illustrator. Also, there's a panel inside of Illustrator for image trace, which I have open just here. There's also a big advanced section just in here. If you try to find this panel, window image trace is where it's at. So this is the issue we've got here. Well, it's not a problem at this stage. It's actually a great image trace. It's turned our bitmap image into a nice vector image. But the problem is all of these settings here are global settings. So if, for example, we came in here and changed the number of corners, or we change the number of paths, what it's actually doing is it's changing that for the entire image. We can't, for example, change the threshold value for a local part. So we can change it for the whole, but not for a local part. So I want to show you how we can actually leverage Photoshop to give us access to change the settings in a local area, which will actually affect just that local area within our image trace. So I'm just going to select that and delete that. And let's dive over into Photoshop. So again, here's my original image just out on my desktop. I'm going to drag that into Photoshop. And let's immediately save this as a Photoshop file. So let's do a file save as, pop it onto my desktop, and let's call it adjusted. And I beg your pardon, we need to make sure that is a Photoshop file. So there we go, desktop adjusted.psd. And there she is just there. So we've now got a second file on our desktop. And let me just create, say, a quick dummy layer on top. And let's do something silly, like I'm going to grab my brush tool and I'm just going to put a big black stroke right through the middle of this image. Ridiculous, I know, but I'm just making a point. So let's save that, Command or Control S. And let's dive back into Illustrator just now. So this time, instead of dragging in my original image from the desktop, I'm going to drag in adjusted. And let's position that just like so. And let's run an image trace on this. So under my properties panel, I'm going to choose image trace, defaults. And there we have it. So you can see we've got our image trace, but we've now got that big, silly black line running through there. So that's just proving the point, guys, that a change that we make in Photoshop is going to be showing up inside of our image trace. And if I dive into Photoshop, if I delete that layer and save that, if I now dive back into Illustrator, you can see it's immediately saying that the linked file, which is our adjusted.psd file, has been changed. Would we like to update it? Let's just choose yes. And there we go. We're now back to the original place where we started. But we now know what we're going to be doing moving forward. Any adjustments that we make at a local level within the Photoshop file will be showing up inside of our Illustrator file. So let's get busy doing a few edits. So I'm going to add a curves adjustment layer. And here we go, curves. And let's actually call this one curves darken. And I'm going to set a curve, something like this. The specifics of these curves doesn't matter, guys. Actually, you don't even have to use curves here. You could be using, say, levels, for example. I'm just using an adjustment layer to darken in this situation, and then I'm going to create another one in a minute to lighten. Now, I don't want to darken the entire image, just very specific portions. So I'm going to first click on the mask and then press Command or Control I to invert the mask. So now, yes, this layer darkens, but because the entire mask is set to black, we don't actually see that popping up here just yet. So if I now click on my mask, I'm going to press B to grab my brush tool. You can see I've got white selected as my foreground color just here. So if I was to paint through the mask just here, you can see it's actually darkening in an area of the face just there. But let's get a little bit more specific here. So I'm just going to press undo there. So let's dive into Illustrator, and you can see this area just through here. I would actually like to see more of the face showing up just here. Maybe darken a bit of the mustache just in here. So inside of Photoshop, I'm going to actually just paint through here. Now you'll notice that my brush is at 100%. Maybe that's a little bit too strong, so I'm going to undo that and maybe drop the brush down to something like 30%. So we can then actually do like a few multiple little sweeps through here. So if I darken this up just here, maybe a little bit in the mustache as well. Let's save that. Jump into Illustrator, update. Actually, I'm just going to move this up here, so keep a close eye on here, okay? As soon as I choose yes, there we go. We've now darkened up the area just in here, and I've also got some more definition in the face, which is great. So this is working really, really well. Diving back into Photoshop. But it does kind of suck here, working with this odd collection of darkening and then brightening, which I'm going to do in just a moment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce a threshold. Now, if you can't see what I'm doing just off screen there, I was going to go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Threshold. Let's just call this Threshold. Choose OK. So what the Threshold Adjustment Layer does is you can set a number. By default, it comes in at 128, remembering luminance values in Photoshop range between 0 and 255. So this is going right down the middle. Anything which is up to a level of 50% in terms of intensity, in terms of levels, will be black. Anything above that will be white. So the reason I'm doing that here in Photoshop is because by adding this threshold level, if I turn off darken and then turn it back on, this is actually giving me a much closer representation inside of Photoshop of what we're actually seeing inside of Illustrator. So I like to turn this threshold layer on and then just leave it at the top. Do a bunch of stuff in between the image and the threshold layer, that is, and that's letting me know what it's going to look like inside of Illustrator. So we've seen that we can darken up some areas, which is great. Let me show you how to lighten up some areas. So I'm going to add another curves adjustment layer. And let's call this one curves lighten. Now, again, what's great with adding this threshold adjustment layer just here is I don't now have to dive into Photoshop to see how my image trace is sort of going to look. I can already see that the shirt area is extremely dark. So I'd like to lighten that up a bit. So in my curves lighten, well, firstly, we should actually create a curve that's going to lighten things, right? So look at that, that's adjusting the whole image, which is what we don't want, of course. So I'm going to select the mask, invert that, and then let's grab my brush tool. So we know that with a black mask, anywhere that I paint with white is going to start allowing that curves adjustment layer to affect the image. So again, with my mask targeted, I've got my brush, 30%, that's pretty good. So let's start painting through the shirt here. And you can already see that I'm able to lighten very specific areas. So I'm kind of liking that. And also maybe the chin area is looking very heavy through there. So I can paint through there and lighten up. Now that increased dramatically, even only at 30%. So let's undo that. Maybe we drop our brush down to something like 10% and let's paint through there. Nice, so that's giving me much finer control. So I can actually paint in multiple sweeps here and get very, very specific about where I want to lighten areas. So I'm pretty happy with that. Maybe lighten up this area just up here a little bit. And maybe see if I can bring back a little bit of detail in the eyes. So maybe I switch to the curves darken section and I can just paint a little bit in the eyes. Very nice. So it's bringing back a little bit of detail inside of the eyes, making those slightly heavier. Maybe brighten up the side of the face a little bit just there. So again, guys, this is obviously to taste, and I'm doing this in a bit of a hurry. So you will take your time a little bit more, of course. Oh, one other thing that I often like to do is I will group all of the contents inside of here. So I'm just selecting those and pressing Command or Control G, and I can just call that adjustments. So the reason I like to do that is functionally everything is still the same, but now I can actually turn off and on those adjustments, all of them, with a single click of this eyeball just here. So I'm going to save this because we spent a lot of time in Photoshop, let's dive into back into Illustrator and see how this is looking. So here inside of Illustrator, that's what it was a few moments ago. And yes, let's update our file. And there we go. So the whole image is now a lot more even. You can see we've got some good definition through here. We've lightened up that extremely dark shirt. And so all in all, it's looking much more balanced. So that's pretty much it there, guys. Just showing you how you can use Photoshop to locally adjust parts of your image, which will then be reflected inside of your image trace inside of Illustrator. Hope you learned something. Thanks for listening. Cheers, guys.